should have been put down like rabid dogs. The first night, he said another one. Well, that's what we're looking at today. Well, what if the protesters were put down by like rabid dogs? The question is, and we've looked at it doing a little bit of modeling here, if those guns were turned, how many protesters would they need to kill to, as they say, enlarge the incident? Well, we looked at it in terms of, say, if 5 people were shot or 10 people, what would be the reaction? Well, the reaction would be the protesters would get mad, more people would descend there, and the thing could spread all over St. Louis County and into the city of St. Louis and even across the nation. So it would have been a provocative act that would have caused other things to appear. And one of the things we see here, there's this whole tendency, we've covered a number of races lately, Gunner Joe out in Miller out in Alaska, a fellow that says he has better guns than the military. But this whole gun culture that they have fostered plays into this right-wing scenario. Now, what happens with these right-wingers as their Tea Party favorite candidates are not getting into the political situation? They are being, as they say, sidelined. Well, then these people, where do they go? Well, they are well organized, they have guns, but primarily in these police departments. Old Page is not by himself. There are many of those people in those departments. It's just Page had a record. And now, no doubt about it, the Homeland Security people know who these oath keepers are because they've been, as they say, talking. Loose lips does sink ships. And they have the surveillance capability. They have the surveillance capabilities to figure out what the late Bin Laden was talking about in mountainous villages. They can definitely figure out what these right wingers are talking about. So it's a situation as what they're going to do. On Bundy's farm, they did not act as they could have, because if they'd have brought in the same kind of military equipment, it would be it. So what we are doing is here, the question, this is from the Associated Press, in the Afro News here. But anyway, this is the question, this is our working title. What happens if the grand jury fails to indict Officer Wilson? They put it in white column. Anyway, the composition of the grand jury is 9 whites, 3 blacks, 9 votes required to indict. Well, they more than likely will not get the 9 votes. So I'll just read the article. Conditions are claimed this week in Ferguson after nights of sometimes violent. Well, they weren't that violent actually, but that's a media characterization there. After the fatal shooting of an African American by Wilson, but a delicate and critical question lingers. What happens if the grand jury, now considering the case, does not return a charge against the officer? The fear among some local residents and officials trying to maintain peace in Ferguson is that the failure to charge the officer could stroke new anger amongst the community, profoundly mistrustful of the legal system. Senator Claire McCaskill, an early supporter of President Obama, they had a huge meeting for him out in her hometown of Springfield, Missouri. She's pushing for federal and local investigation to be complete around the same time so that all evidence in the case can be made public, a step many consider important should the prosecutor decide not to charge the officer. Her office said on Friday, she used to be a prosecutor incidentally, hasn't been given a timeline there in this Dan Wilson case. McCaskill, a former Missouri prosecutor, said she's hopeful that the physical evidence in the case, including blood spatter, very important, patterns, clothing, shell casings, will provide incomparable facts about what happened during the shooting. She said whatever local prosecutors decide, it will be important to explain the decision by providing the physical evidence. Now, when you start talking about blood spatter, that's to end interpretation. Now, clothing, no. Shell casings, well, they pretty much have this. And it wouldn't be possible if the federal investigation is going on. There are 2 African women on the jury, 1 African male. That's the 12-member jury. That was from the court administrator Fox in the St. Louis County Circuit Court. McCaskill said she urged Attorney General Holder during a meeting earlier this week to speed up what is typically a lengthy federal process. What we want to avoid is a decision being made without all the information being available to the public. Also, McCaskill said, adding that not being able to do so could create more stress and certainly more fear that we would be back to worrying about people being able to protect safety. Obviously, for us, we're concerned not just about this process be fair, but what does the next 6 months look like? Well, the next 6 months of this, and remember, a grand jury indictment is only a grand jury indictment. There has to be a trial. So that's basically pro forma. The attorney could have went in the other direction and just simply charged Wilson, and then he would have had his preliminary hearing, and we would have moved on with the process. He did not do this. So now a lot will fall upon what is happening with the propaganda part. Now, we've seen these chiefs marching with the NAACP. There's also a campaign, I Love Ferguson. I'm sure how anybody can love Ferguson. So these kinds of things all play in here, and this is one has to understand. When you have protests, as we've had, and the monopoly media get hold of the situation, they have the big pipes, using lemons, etc., to convince enough people that there is other things going on. Just as they're talking about some witness you can barely hear shooting some video with a different version. Well, today anyone can literally be providing so-called testimony in the background. That is manipulation of audio. So you can do anything you want in the digital age as far as manipulating video or audio, and as far as the authentication process depends upon whom the witness is that does that. So this district attorney, which the people have no actual belief that he would do a fair thing, McCullough, his father was a cop, his mother was a cop, his relatives worked for St. Louis police, his father was killed while involving an African American suspect. So he has a reason to hate African Americans. But as people know all of this information, they know right away that they're not going to get a fair shake with this fellow. So then where do they go from there? Well, this is where these NAACP marches and other things take hold. The NAACP, and this is unfortunate, has been a corporate organization for some time. They've had various corporate types there, and don't know anything about their current CEO and the way that they're going. But will this have an effect on the greater mass of people? No, because they're not members of the NAACP and they're not marching behind that banner. But when it's projected on TV with Lemon and all of his cronies, people that watch CNN and watch Fox and all these, they'll get all of these images. Let me finish this article here. Without specifically mentioning the grand jury's racial makeup, Benjamin Crump said the panel works perfectly as long as the prosecutor presents the necessary evidence and doesn't withhold information. Well, he can make it up as he goes. Trump said the family does not believe the grand jury was necessary, arguing that the prosecutor had sufficient grounds to charge. That's true. A charge doesn't mean Wilson was guilty of anything. It's just simply that Wilson shot Mr. Brown, which Wilson would not deny. Therefore, he's charged. That's all that goes on there. So the Justice Department's run a parallel investigation. Hoover boys are fanning out there trying to find witnesses. And as far as finishing both investigations simultaneously would be unusual because federal investigations typically work independent of the state counterparts and at their own pace. This is from Paul Cassell, a former federal judge who is a professor at the University of Utah, a law professor there. That is one of the advantages of federal investigations. They tend to have a little more distance from the police officers who are being investigated. That provides some assurance of objectivity, he said. He said prosecutors must avoid considering the potential action, even a violent one, on whether to file a charge. In any case, he said, they must make dispassionate judgments uninfluenced by public opinion. Well, it's very difficult to do because the prosecutor itself is a creature of the so-called political culture, is a politician, and that happens. In other words, it's a whole political situation. This is something that a lot of people don't understand. The whole thing created by the Buchanan, the party of Pat Buchanan, is responsible for polarizing these people, but they were not polarized out of the air. Behind those people are people like the infamous Koch brothers, formerly of Wichita, Kansas, and now of Los Angeles, or maybe they're in Palm Springs and in Florida. But the most likely state charge that would be considered in such a case includes second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter. Well, yeah, any of those. I think any charge with this character would satisfy the general public, and you probably would see that coming. We had a march also today into Staten Island, and that was on Eric Garner's situation. Thousands of people followed the march led by Dr. Rev-al-Sharpton. So we're continually seeing these things happen, but to answer the question, what will happen if the prosecutor, McCulloch, does not come in with an indictment, is very difficult to gauge, because evidently his stratagem is to stretch this out a month or so, in other words, where the quote-unquote intensity dies down, and let the propaganda machine take over. Now, in Trayvon Martin, it was a totally different situation. It was never that intense until after the situation where there was no charge at all. But what one has to understand, just because these people have this so-called grand jury, all it means is it's pro forma. It doesn't mean they're serious about charging Wilson with anything. Period, or they could have done this, and it has not happened. So this is where you really have to understand it's a legal process that is placed within a political process that is guided by polarization. So if you have one faction that believes this, another faction that believes another version, you're not going to have any middle ground. So what they're attempting to do by using NACP and using Ballard and these other characters walking hand in hand, giving out cold water, quite literally, is to present to the public that these are peaceful, helpful, white officers, chiefs. They're hugging people that they gassed the night before. But when people see this, if they see enough of it, their mindset tends to change. Now, the other people, the oath keepers and all those, they're not passing out ice water. They'd like to pass out 40 caliber bullets. So in other words, those people will continue on.